Yes, then good afternoon again to everyone who has joined us for this Empress Elisabeth double feature. We have two speakers this afternoon. First, Kaitlin Ward from our own university and our own project, followed by Evelyn Knappitsch from Graz University. Let me quickly introduce the two speakers. Kaitlin is currently doing an MA in East European Studies, and this is how we met. She already holds an MA in linguistics, so that's a bit of a move from A to B. And she has kindly joined us as a research student last year for the project and has been one of the people most actively helping us to develop our database and also our crowdsourcing initiative with which we invite people working in or on spas to help us filling in details. And she will actually, her talk will also hopefully be an advertisement for the use of the database, because she will be following the trajectories of Empress Elisabeth in her lifetime or over her lifetime with the help of the database technology. Our second speaker is Evelyn Knappitsch from the University of Graz. She holds a PhD in history, and guess what her book is on? Yes, it is about Empress Elisabeth, and as I just learned, she's about looking for a publisher, and we will see whether the book will come out with one of the public publishers as an entertainment for a larger audience, or rather as a more academic book with an academic publisher. She's currently doing a new research project which has to do with military censorship and spying on the Austro-Italian front during World War I. Very much looking forward for the results of these researches, obviously, as well. But for the time being, this afternoon, she will present us a very interesting episode, perhaps more in the life of a young man than of the Empress, but we're looking forward to learn about the details. So without much further ado, Kaitlin, the screen is yours.
Okay.
Please, 20 to 25 minutes as we agreed.
Okay. Go into slideshow mode. All is well? I hope. So thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to be here and to present to you today my preliminary and exploratory study on Empress Sisi and her travels. As Christian mentioned, this project was born out of a bigger project in which the European Spa Project is using Nodegoat, which is an online database tool to map and trace the spread of European spa and seaside resorts, but also to map and trace the travels of spa goers. And since Empress Sisi was a prolific spa traveler, this project that I'm working on was born out of that larger one. So when I was given the encouragement and the green light to do this project, I actually first had to learn a little bit about her. As an American, Sisi is not part of my cultural zeitgeist at all. I hadn't heard of her before coming here to Europe, and once I was here, I knew she liked candied violets, but that was pretty much the extent of my knowledge on her. As I started reading about her, I noticed there were quite a few themes or motifs that seemed to emerge in how she's presented and remembered today. That fact that, yes, she was born in 1837 to a small royal Bavarian family, and only at the age of 15 and 16, she met and then married her husband, who was also her cousin, the Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. And it's an early romance that's a big highlight of how she's presented, but pretty quickly she seemed to resist and fall out of favor with her role as an empress and fall out of favor with the court. Her husband was very busy and thus rather distant from her, yet her mother-in-law, who was also her aunt, was rather overbearing and micromanaged her and took control over even the rearing of her children. And so Sisi really retracted from her role as empress and from the strict cultural protocol of the courts. And thus she became presented and known to be as a somewhat absent empress, someone who didn't really want to take on and embody the role that she was married into. Another general, very prominent theme surrounding her is this cult of the body. And I liked this picture because it essentially embodies all the aspects of her that people tend to hone in on and highlight today. This very thin 18-inch waist, this crown of beautiful, well-maintained hair. She was this enigmatic beauty who really eschewed court society, but also the public. So she was, rather hidden, but also very performative surrounding the image of her. And she really did take control of this cult of beauty. She exercised excessively. She spent hours a day on her hair, and she stopped posing for portraits and photographs after the age of 30 to help perpetuate this internally youthful and beautiful role that she kind of fell into and then helped construct. Another big theme that seemed to present itself to me was that she's presented as being chronically melancholic. She was a shy, quiet, and to a certain degree sad person. But after her son committed suicide in 1889, it seemed that her mental health just took a precipitous fall, and it declined from melancholy into full-blown mental illness. And it is around this time too that she is assumed to have really ramped up this image of being the absent empress, and the travels that she had taken in her lifetime were thus exacerbated to the extent that she's said to have just aimlessly and listlessly traveled from the on point of her son's suicide until she was assassinated in 1898 in Geneva. So I was curious, as I was getting to build this database, if once I collected all of this information on her travels, how that would fit in with the memory of her and how she's presented in today. There we go. Okay. So what's nice about Nodegoat is that you are the architect of your own database. And while I have collected all sorts of types of information, the ones that I'll focus on today for this talk is, since I wanted to look at her travels, I wanted to collect the self-evidence, the wheres and the whens. So the name of the locations of the places she went to, and also the starting and end dates of when she was there, so that I would have an idea of how long she spent at each place. And then I also wanted to know what types of places she went to. So I tagged each space as either being some type of resort, whether that was a spa resort or a seaside resort or a lake resort. And then the place could also be considered a port town or city. I had a general category of other. So for general places like Prague, for example, would fit into that category. And in one of my iterations, because building a database is very ad hoc and iterative, I went back and decided to add the category of residency, because I realized if I really wanted a true holistic picture of Sisi and her travels, I also had to take into account where she resided when she wasn't traveling. And so I thus began to do the research, where I took a lot of biographies and books, and anytime I came across a a mention of her traveling somewhere, I tagged it and then manually entered this information into this database. And so I wanted the quantitative data that I just mentioned, the wheres and the whens, but I also wanted more nuanced and qualitative data. So in addition to the general historical writings on her, I also looked at diary entries and newspapers and letters. Those are mostly in German, and that process is still ongoing, but I also, I wanted to include some excerpts of more qualitative data, because within that lies the ability to do text tagging, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So it's a balance of this quantitative and qualitative approach to building this database surrounding her travels. So what we see here is the first dot, the first entry point of, I think at this point, there are 448 data points that I've entered into this database on her. Oh, I guess I'm in charge of entering people. Sorry about that. Okay. Yes, so what we're looking at here is the first travel data point I've entered into the database. And this is actually when she went to go meet Franz Ferdinand, her future husband, on August 16th in 1853. We see that date down here. And what's nice is that in Nodegoat, all of these locations are also geotagged so that they will appear in real space on these types of Google Maps. So you can visualize this data geographically, but the visualizations also enable you to watch the emergence of these dots, which mark her points of travel over time as well. And I'll show you the visualization, and you'll see that as this bar moves from 1853 to her death in 1898, we'll see a lot of red dots pop up on the map. Okay. So what I noticed, I watched this visualization of all of her travels, all 448 dots popping up on the map. And what seemed to emerge to me, patterns of her travels, there seemed to be about 3 phases of them. And this first phase here that I'll show you is from 1853 to 1874. And you'll see that first dot of her in Bad Ischl meeting Franz Ferdinand. And then from there, what you'll notice is a lot of dots popping up in Middle Europe. So you'll see this sidewards W, it looks like, emerging over time. And then but rather relatively slowly, I would say, they emerge. And then you'll see one dot kind of pop up over down here in Madeira when she became very ill, gravely ill, and she was encouraged or facilitated to travel there for rest cures. And we'll see her travel back up. But for the most part, you'll notice that her travels are concentrated on the continent. So I hope the video is working. There isn't supposed to be sound, so if you see something, then that's good.
Oh mon Dieu.
Okay, so that was the first about 20 years of during her tenure as Empress. The second pattern that emerged for me this phase seemed to occur between 1874 and 1885. And in this part of the visual, you'll notice that she's moving beyond this Central European periphery and expanding up to Ireland and England. She was big into hunting and riding horses. So you'll see a lot of dots. She spent many summers and hunting seasons up in that region. We'll also see at this point, she takes a trip with her husband down the Dalmatian coast. So we'll see the Austrian Riviera turn red a little bit. And again, with a lot more concentrated dots within Central Europe. Okay. And then the third and final phase that seemed to emerge to me, oh, that's the same one. Sorry. I can't really, okay. The third and final phase for me that seemed to emerge was in the final decade of her life, essentially, starting from 1885. She's no longer hunting in Ireland and England, and she's sailing more around the Mediterranean. So the claims of her taking to the seas is definitely captured here in this data. We'll see dots pop up over in Troy in Turkey. She went to Cairo a couple of times, and the Tunisian Algerian coast as well. We'll see her in the Atlantic, stopping at Lisbon and in Biarritz. So she is very much more on the sea at this point. Another part of this phase that really struck me was the speed at which the dots emerge. So the first visualization compared to this, that was relatively slow. This one is almost like a finale of fireworks. So there's going to be, especially after 1889, when her son does commit suicide, you will see kind of this flurry cacophony of red dots appearing on the screen, which does align with the idea that she did travel more and further afield after his death. Okay. So this is it. This is all 448 places that I've been able to enter into the database of where she's been in her tenure as Empress. That in and of itself, I mean, it was a lot of work condensed down to a 2-minute video, but there's a lot still to work with. And because this particular topic for today is centered around her spa and seaside visits, I wanted to take a look at what this map would look like once categorized for those types of places. So I had mentioned before that I tagged each place according to what type of place it was. So here on the map now, you'll see that the lake resorts are in pink, and they're mostly around Switzerland. And so we have our seaside resorts, which are in dark blue. I've designated port towns or cities in red, and spa resorts are the lighter blue. And then I have that general category of other, which is purple. So places, like I said, like Prague would fit into that category. And then the residencies, the royal residencies are green. So that's also, it kind of explains why they're a lot bigger. She spent obviously a lot of time in Vienna, in Budapest, in the summer residence at Bad Ischl. So, deciding what is what may seem relatively straightforward, but a lot of these decisions that I had to make when it, data is messy, even things that might be seemingly straightforward. So I have a lot of ambivalence with some of my decisions, especially when it comes to port towns and seaside resorts. How do you distinguish between what? But I made this decision based on looking at kind of the functions of what she was doing there. So if she just used the places to get over to England, to go to the seaside, I designated one as a port and the other as the seaside. But like I said, talking about messy data could be its own conversation. I'd be happy to talk about it later. But these are the decisions I made for today. And when I filtered to look at just the seaside resorts and the spa towns, this is what the map looks like now. And if we look at this over time, this again is starting from 1860, it says, and it'll run through to her assassination in 1898. Okay, so I didn't tell you what to look for this time, but probably what you noticed was that it was relatively slow in the beginning, and then it ramps up later on. Sorry. Okay. This bar chart shows that a little more clearly, I think. So this is made in Nodegoat, in the database that allows you to create these types of visualizations as well. So we see in the very beginning, really not much is going on. Each bar represents one trip. So for example, in 1890, I should explain this a little bit. In 1890, I've noted that she went to 8 different spa or seaside resorts. And then as you can kind of deduce, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So these are absolute numbers that are represented in this graph. So we saw the beginning, the dot on the map pop up in the same spot 5 times. That was Bad Kissingen, and we see that represented here. So overall, it does give an impression. She didn't really travel much to spas or seasides early on in her life, but that it definitely increased and was more consistent part of her travel plans after, this says 1883. it's a nice representation, but one thing I find a little misleading about it is that because it's absolute numbers, each trip has equal weight and value in these representation. So while, for example, it may look like she did semi-significant traveling here in 1874, the reality is that two of these trips were just day trips. A day trip over to visit Queen Victoria and the Isle of Wight, and a day trip in Baden-Baden to have lunch with the German Kaiser. So while I'm not sure if Nodegoat has the capacity to make different types of graphs, I do know that you can export the data to use in other platforms. And that's where my partner Jeroen comes in, because I gave him the data and he helped me represent it in a different way. So before was absolute values just in terms of numbers of trips. And then what this chart here shows is the percentage of time spent at those locations on her trips. So as we see here, 86% of the time from, again, the beginning of her tenure as Empress, or fiance as future Empress in 1853 through her death, 86% of the time was not spent at seasides and spas. 9% was spent at seaside resorts and 5% was spent at spas. So overall, 14% of her life as Empress was spent at these types of resorts. Here's that trip to Madeira I had mentioned in the beginning, where she was gravely ill and she took a sojourn there for an extended period of time. Here are her trips to Kissingen. The last chart only showed it as one visit, but she did spend a lot of time in Meran. And then we also have a lot of quiet period of time where things start ramping up in terms of percentage and also just consistency of traveling is starting here, I think, around 1883. And so while only 14% of these decades were spent at seasides and spas, in the last year of her life, about 70% of that year was spent at a seaside or spa resort. So I think it clearly shows a ramp up of traveling activities. Her son died in 1889. So again, it was definitely a pivotal year of travel for her. But what I thought was interesting about this chart that wasn't obvious to me based on the readings I had done of her up until this point was how to explain this part of her trips. The advent of her travels, to me, didn't really start with the death of her son, but something else. So I was curious if I looked a little more closely at the qualitative data that I had that I've started gathering, if perhaps something would be revealed there to explain this. And yeah, that's where it gets into the text tagging of the qualitative data. So this is just an example, just so you know what I'm talking about, because I think it's a little abstract. This is just a screenshot of part of my data entry for one of the travels that Sisi had taken to Kissingen in her last year of life. And this is actually a translation of a diary excerpt from her daughter, Marie Valerie, who went to Kissingen to visit her. And yeah, again, when you talk about data and it being messy and arbitrary and subjective, as the architect of this database, it's still a work in progress, but I'm gonna let Catherine Lloyd in. Okay. It's still a work in progress, but what I'm doing at this point is just going through and reading the excerpts I've included and highlighting and tagging words or phrases that I want to maybe see if in individual entries, if a theme kind of pops up to me, if I see that theme pop up in other entries, they may be disparate dots in this database, but because you can tag them and click on each of these tags, you can kind of see how many data entries you have that, that are about the same topic. So far I have topics like melancholy, because again, that was a big theme that was that kept coming up whenever I would read about her. She was an avid walker and horseback rider, so I'm trying to keep track of her physical activities and routines. I'm also curious, again, because it's a spa project, if I can get a better picture of what her daily routines were like at these resort towns. So that's a particular tag I have going. I'm also curious to keep track of who she meets at these spa resorts. So here in Kissingen, they met the Regent of Brunswick, for example. Something I can't get into in this presentation, but you can also look at social networking maps and see who met with whom in certain places. And that's also very interesting, that I can maybe talk about more if someone has questions. But the main gist is that I was curious to see what would emerge from the qualitative data thus far, to see if maybe I could explain what was happening that really, if not caused, but is at least correlated with that increase of travel period in the mid 1880s to the spa towns and seasides. So, for example, what I realized is that I was tagging a lot for the topic of sciatica. And so this is what happens when you click on the tag, it pulls all of the entries together that have that same tag. So we can see here that I think it's over 10, maybe 11 or 12 entries where there's some mention of Empress Sisi suffering from or seeking alleviation from her sciatica. And thus far, I have dates that starting in 1884, this topic seems to emerge. And then they're tied to specifically a lot of seaside resorts, and where she was getting massages in Amsterdam and taking curative baths in Gastein and everything like that. So the sciatica seems to be very much tied to or in connection with these trips to these spas and seaside resorts. One that doesn't have as many, but is in the same time period, starting around 1884, I noticed that I was tagging for rheumatism or arthritis. And so it also seems to be that around this time, she's actively seeking relief for these physical conditions at the spa towns. So 1884, 1887, all three of these are preceding the death of Rudolf. So when I look again at this chart and I take into consideration the dates of which I noticed that a lot of poor health or physical conditions like sciatica and rheumatism were prevalent in what I've stored in the database. Now this seems to make a little more sense, that her wanderings and her travels to these resorts weren't necessarily caused or fallout of Rudolph's suicide, but were instead, in fact, because her physical condition was in serious decline, or was beginning to decline. I shouldn't say serious because I wasn't there. But when I think about how this fits into how she's presented, it's definitely not prominent. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that talking about her physical conditions or illnesses weren't there at all, but it most certainly, when I think about how the cult of her body is represented online or in a lot of books, it's a big focus on her beauty and her waist and how thin she was and how she excessively dieted and exercised to maintain her beauty. sciatica and rheumatism are definitely not sexy. So I can see why they're not necessarily prominent, but from the data, I think that we can see that there does seem to at least be a correlation between the decline of her body and the reasons why she's traveling, where it's not necessarily because of mental illness or a desire to necessarily lose weight. Yeah, so I have to leave it at that. Of course, I'd be happy to talk about anything further. Yeah, but just for the sake of time, I'll leave you with this picture of Sisi. She's there on the left in the gray dress, and this was supposedly taken, or this was painted during a trip she took to Bad Schwalbach in 1871 with her cousin Ludwig, who's more in the center. But yeah, I'll kind of abruptly end it for the sake of time here. If I could.
Okay, thank you so much, Kaitlin. I mean, that's lots of questions that will probably pop up then after we have had and heard the second talk. Yeah, I should sort of not talk, but also push on the button for the applause, but I verbalize it hereby. So very, very interesting. And as I said, there will be definitely questions. But if there's not any of those questions very, very urgent, then I would suggest that we give the screen now to Evelyn for her presentation. Evelyn, please.
Thank you for the invitation. And I have to say again, I'm very happy and I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak here in this setting. And I will start with my slides. A moment, please. Okay, does it work? Yes, it works. And you all can hear me. Okay. Okay, my talk will follow Kaitlin's and go into detail with a close-up, and it will take us what did she do there? What did Elisabeth do during the time she traveled around from spa to spa? At least for the time from 1887 to 1888, I will give one possible answer. At this time, Elisabeth was around 50 years old, and she wrote poems, especially while traveling, which she sometimes formed into short stories. My lecture is based on a romantic tale by Sisi, which was not only her most extensive story, but also stood out from the rest of her writings because Elisabeth did not write it alone. She integrated letters from an admirer 20 years her junior. His name is Alfred Gurniak Edler von Schreibendorf, and with whom she had met several times in various European spas in the late 1880s. Here I show you the very beginning of the story in Sisi's notebook. That's the original notebook. I hope you see it all and you see the text. She called it Titania and Alfred here. And the next line, romantische Erzählung in Reimen und Briefen, that's something like Titania and Alfred, the romantic tale in rhymes and letters. Yes, and die Briefe dazu im Manuskript, that means something like the letters in manuscript. Yes, and Alfred Gurniak's letters shows us that the Empress's fiction had a hidden real background without telling us exactly where fantasy ends and the reality starts. But before I go into detail here, I would like to tell you something more about the history of the source and how I came across it. More than 10 years ago, the so-called poetische Tagebuch der Kaiserin Elisabeth, this one, in English, I think it's something like The Poetic Diary of Empress Elisabeth. It came into my hands, and it had been published first in 1980 by the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and it contained most of Elisabeth's poems, which she had written in the 1980s. The editor, you can see here, is Brigitte Hamann. Yes, and Elisabeth had kept her poems in iron-safe cassettes, which became time capsules after her death. She addressed them for later publication to the president of the Swiss Confederation in 1950. She wished an edition of her writings and dedicated the proceeds of the sale for the benefit of civil rights fighters. 2 of Elisabeth's cassettes were indeed delivered in the 1950s. A third may have been lost, yes. In my opinion, she was inspired by one of her most favorite books. It was written by Henry Rider Haggard, and a real bestseller, but maybe also, I'll show you, I have it here. Yes, that's She, A History of Adventure. And here you can see the cassette. Yes, but maybe also by Heinrich Heine's poem, Das Kästchen des Darius. In both cases, cassettes play an important role. They are, to speak with Aleida Assmann, memory boxes, and they are made for storing mementos. The Swiss government, however, wasn't impressed at all when the boxes arrived in Bern in the early 1950s and did not release the hidden contents of the boxes. They considered the quality of the poems to be not particularly high and the content irrelevant, but possibly damaging to Elisabeth's reputation because of the not further described erotic aspects. I'll show you an internal piece here. Yes. It's a letter by the Chancellor addressed to the President. And yeah, in German, it's about Alfred's Briefe. That's an envelope, and in that envelope, there were the letters we are talking about, and the Chancellor writes in German. Moment, please. Es handelt sich dabei offensichtlich um etwas Romantisches. Ob sie irgendeinen kommerziellen Wert haben, und zwar für Sammler oder Historiker, ist zweifelhaft. Jedenfalls bin ich der Meinung, dass es sich um Dokumente handelt, die anständigerweise nicht an die Öffentlichkeit zu gelangen haben. And in English, moment, there is someone coming. Let me see. Okay.
Evelyn, we can read it from the document, so perhaps it's not necessary to repeat it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So, okay. Let me see. Yes, in the end, they placed the material under something like archive restriction for the next few decades until Brigitte Hamann came across in the I think in the late 1970s, and she requested access. And a few years later, she edited most of the sources in a publication series and called Fontes Rerum Austriacarum. I showed you the book. Yes, and while I was reading the notes, an unexpectedly aggressive section caught my eye. In note 11 of the introduction, Hamann recorded that the so-called literarischer Nachlass, literary bequest of Elisabeth, also included an envelope with several letters. The Empress also wanted them to be published as a part of her romantic romance, Titania and Alfred, as Hamann confessed. But Hamann, however, would refrain from printing the letters since they could only have been written by a probably an insane stranger who was, in her opinion, without meaning or importance for history. Okay. And this incredibly rude words for publication of the Academy of Sciences never left my mind. And years after, I set out to find the letters. Yes. Even apart from Hamann, they have not been quoted in any Sisi biography. I have explained this fact to myself by the reason that Sisi historiography mostly works like icon painting, and the source base has hardly been expanded in the last 90 years. Up to now, all biographies are based on one book from Egon Caesar Conte. It's called Elisabeth, die seltsame Frau, the strange woman, and it was first published in 1934. Yes, that's an important thing because then, yeah, I will tell you later. And so, having found nothing in the available literature, I went to the Federal Archives in Bern, Switzerland, and consult the original letters. And once I started reading them, it became clear to me what could have upset Brigitte Hamann, who described herself as a fact-centered researcher. These letters did not provide facts, but an auto-fictional fairy tale in which witches and fairies populated the modern world, spas and cities. And in short, for historians who are looking for facts, this is too much confusion of the real and fictional. Yes. And the first letter, I have it here for you, starts with a narrator telling the Empress about an Indian fairy tale and asking kindly for her attention to his story. The letter reached Elisabeth at an opportune moment when she had just caught a cold in London, and it was in March 1888, and she was unable to leave her hotel room, and so some entertainment was probably welcome to her. But already at a second glance, it becomes clear that this is not some fairy tale being told to a neutral listener. Gurniak tells the Empress the story of their time together, encoded in dream sequences of a young ancient Indian nobleman who long time ago was fallen in love with a beautiful queen with the eyes of a gazelle. He also encodes his desires in dreams. Perhaps he did so because he was afraid then somebody else could read the letter, but I think he addressed it to Sisi's lady in waiting, Sarolta Mailad, and maybe he was afraid that she could go and tell somebody else, but I think it's because maybe also he knew that Elisabeth loved riddles and loved fairy tales. Yeah, and the letter ends with the bewitched young man in deep India confessing his love by writing a letter to his adored queen, asking her to decide the outcome of the fairy tale. From the more than clear hints in the letter, it can be reconstructed that the Empress and Alfred Gurniak had met a year earlier in Herculesbad, Bale Herculane. Yes, and they had met several times there. Maybe, I think they met on the forest paths. They had greeted each other occasionally, but had not entered to conversation. Sisi remembered the sad young man on the bank of the river and recognized the sender in him. A few weeks later, a second letter reached Elizabeth in Bournemouth on the English south coast. In it, Alfred Gurniak continued his tale and announced that the Indian ruler and her bewitched nobleman would soon meet in B.B., Baden-Baden, which was the next stop on Elizabeth's trip. Gurniak, who was born into a Silesian business family and had grown up in Galicia, did not work and lived off a small inheritance, followed by until he had free time to follow Sisi again, and this was possible. It was even possible because the Austrian press announced almost all the Empress trips. So if you just had a newspaper, you know, okay, Sisi will come there next month, or maybe a few days later, a few days earlier. They all it was all announced in the press. Yes, and Gurniak prepared himself, studied all the reports, and he studied also her daily routine in the bath. He chooses his hotels carefully at crossroads so that he could observe her, and also her entourage through the blinds of her of his room window. That's very nice because it reminds me to Hitchcock and the Rare Window. Yeah, but in this way, he got to know her habits and noticed that at twilight, the so-called blue hour, Elizabeth often took long walks in nature, and she took this walks completely alone. And he hoped that this knowledge would provoke a meeting with Elizabeth in Baden-Baden. The Badeblatt, yes, I show you. The Badeblatt, which was publishing all the names of the incoming guests, proves that he was also there at the same time. You see, that's Gräfin von Hohenems, that's Sisi. And if we compare it, that was on Mittwoch, den 18. April. And next slide, there is from 5 days later. And here you see in Französischer Hof, Hotel de France, Gurniak Schreibendorf A von Rentner, Dresden. Yes, he comes from Dresden, and so let's go back here. That was the 18th April, and that's the 5 days after. But I think maybe it's a Monday, maybe he arrived on Saturday or something like that. Yes, and they were there. They stayed in Baden-Baden at the same time, but it didn't work. Alfred was unable to catch her by chance, so he had to ask Elizabeth again for a letter or a message, and which he promptly received, but in Munich. That was Sisi's next stop on her journey. And he received a poem written down here, and this message contained a riddle. Elizabeth took up the fairy tale element, but did not slip into the role of the Indian queen that Gurniak had chosen for her, but answered as the fairy queen Titania, her private alter ego in her poems. And she wrote, the fairy queen would show herself at the Green River, and the Green River stands for the Isar, at a place where wild service berries, I think that are service berries, it's in German, it's called Elsbeere, blossomed, if he could find the spot. But Gurniak wasn't familiar with München, and he wasn't familiar with the Empress's soul topography. He didn't manage it. The Elsbeere, the Elsbeere is a leafy tree, and it's native in Bavaria, but extremely rare. And indeed, it blossomed at the time of the year. But in order to obtain some more information, Górniak simply asked Elisabeth in his reply for direction or for some specific address. And in doing so, he left the setting of the fairy tale, which caused Elisabeth to refuse to provide any information. In short, he waited in vain for another answer, strolled through the streets and parks looking for Sisi without success, but fearing he had already attracted the attention of the secret police, as it was not common in large German cities to simply stroll without a destination, which was part of everyday life in the spas. Yeah. When Elisabeth finally returned to Vienna a little later, she missed Górniak and admitted in one of her poems being in love. Here. But it was not until the summer of the same year that she saw him again in Bad Ischl. Again, Górniak traveled with the intention of meeting her. This time he was luckier. They meet again by chance on the streets of Bad Ischl on the very day of his arrival, which gave the relationship another twist, a new twist. And when Elisabeth traveled on to Bad Gastein at the beginning of July, Górniak was already there, waiting for her. In Gastein, they apparently arranged to meet regularly along the rough mountain trails, which were hardly ever visited by other tourists. When I studied the correspondence for my dissertation and influenced by Franco Moretti, I compared the landscape and the topographies of the places where Górniak tried to meet Elisabeth. And doing so, I noticed that both Gastein and Herkulesbad had many twisted from outside invisible forest paths, which had a positive effect on the connections between Elisabeth and Alfred. While in München and to a certain extent, maybe also in Baden-Baden, I don't know Baden-Baden exactly, but I think it looks like Baden-Baden had also wide and open observable parks like München, which was rather a disadvantage. And so, in my opinion, the special topography did indeed play a major role in the coming together of them, of the two. Yes. And in addition, Górniak obviously dressed as a flashy, colorful flaneur in keeping with the fashion of the time. And in spas, flaneurs were part of everyday life because you have to walk around and it's something like the daily routine there. But in big German cities like München, they were eyed as a shady subculture, which Górniak briefly noted. He noted the difference, yes. Furthermore, the boundaries between the social classes and spa resorts were becoming a little softer, and both as the special landscape, spatial settings there, and the social situation within played a key role, I think so. Yes. Altogether, these circumstances created the framework for the two to come into contact with each other at all, the circumstances they found in the spas. And now I go on and will explain why I called it personal heterotopia in the world of spas. First of all, I have to tell you that during her stay in Bad Gastein, in July, I think in July 1888, Elizabeth gave Alfred Koenig 2 books. One of them was called The Witch. I think, yes, this one. And The Witch, it was written by her friend Carmen Sylvia, and Carmen Sylvia was the queen of Romania. And it was about a beautiful forest witch and called Demona, who attracts men with her pretty wild hair in order to kill them with pleasure. And Demona herself knows no love until a sexually inexperienced young man crosses her path, and whose steady tenderness touches her. Elizabeth probably gave him the book as a storyboard. I think so, yeah. And Koenig agrees to see only Demona in Elizabeth from now on and to be of services to her in every way. I show you, that's the letter here. What can I tell you furthermore? The correspondence shows that they arranged to meet several times in July in the woods and in places above the spa town of Gastein. That yes, and it is not possible to say for sure if they continued the role playing at their real meetings, but I also think so, because however, it seems obvious to me that they extended the fantastic space of the text into the space of the spa town of Gastein, since the role play offered them the opportunity to create their own personal heterotopia. I would like to explain this briefly. Social norms made it impossible for Alfred Koenig to speak to the ruler's wife of his own joys. That's something was even true for the ladies in waiting, who were also not allowed to address the empress without being asked. And Sisi often complained that she was always responsible for keeping the conversation going. It was only when they took up role playing that they were both able to rewrite the rules of interaction, but despite the adaptation, this did not lead to a break with the existing social order. But the result was a private illusionary space in which, according to Foucault's definition of heterotopia, real places were represented and turned over at the same time. Yes, a narrative that was closed, a narrative space that was closed to outsiders, but make communication possible inside and without calling into question the class separation between Koenig and the Empress. For a while, Elizabeth embodied immortal beings with magical powers, but her adorer remained human. That's the story. But what happened next? Elizabeth's text suggested that they were caught and predate. Elizabeth encodes all the scenes in a fairy tale-like manner, but at one point she mentions a real name of a court official, and he's called Karl Linger, who apparently cabled the emperor that his wife was meeting a young man daily in a hard-to-reach place outside the center of Gastein. And several pieces of evidence support this suspicion of the uncovering of their relationship. At the same time, some newspapers reported that the postmaster of Gastein had received a precious diamond ring as a gift from Sisi for his services. And that's a point, because in the I think if you take this, that the postmaster of Gastein get the present, and when I looked through the Empress's secretarial files, I discovered maybe for what favor he got this present. He had handed over all the telegrams that had been sent to the court from Gastein in those days, which one, yes, maybe allowed Sisi to reconstruct what exactly the emperor had been informed on the one hand, and on the other hand, it gave her the opportunity to destroy all the originals. And yes, to come to an end, the romance between Titania and Alfred ended in a very unromantic way a little later. After their meetings were discovered, Sisi broke off. She broke off by placing golden stars in the area where they always met and leaving him a written message. Alfred then wrote to her final letter asking her to pay off the debts he had accumulated through his luxurious stays at the spas in her neighborhood for months, and otherwise he had to shoot himself, he wrote. Elizabeth felt offended and blackmailed by his request, and she felt desired only for the money and angrily swore off love in writing forever. However, in autumn, she found the creative energy to assemble the written remains of their romance, and yes, and in this story, as I told you, she integrated both the poems she had written for Alfred and his letters. Górnik, by the way, had asked her to destroy his letters. Elizabeth did not. She wrote ironically on the envelope. I'll show you here. She did not, and she wrote ironically on the envelope Titania Demona. You can see here. Zahlt 25.000 FL. Für diese Briefe hat also das Eigentumsrecht über dieselben, and that means that she paid for them. And shows she has the right of ownership, and then she crossed everything out in red here, and there is tat es nicht, yes, and she wrote above it she did not, and whether she paid or not, that's still open. I think she paid because he lived until 1934, but it shows a lot about yes, how she felt at the moment. Yes, what I found so interesting about the source is that they create a fantastic space and a fantastic space of communication, and I found it interesting that König and Elizabeth did not communicate in the language of the court. Moreover, König did not speak the language of the court, but they communicate in the language of a popular contemporary literature, from which they took their subjects and used them as topoi for their moods and feelings. Yes, and that worked that in a special way in the spas, because there they belonged, as I told you, they belonged to socially far away classes, but in the spas they could meet in something like an island and come together. It wouldn't be possible for them to visit them at home somewhere else. Sisi couldn't go to Dresden, where König lived at that time, and he couldn't come to the palace in Vienna. So they need the spas as a room, as an open room, and to be someone else. Yes. And that's yes, I think I stop here. I could go on and tell you something about Walter Benjamin and the seine Pariser Passagen, because I think that's something the same. Because that's, for me, I've thought a lot about Gorniak and his place in Sisi's world and his place in the cassettes, and I think it's something like Sisi maybe could only dedicate him this poetic corner in her cassette because there was no way to integrate him in his in her daily life. And yes, also it's like the relationship, because their relationship was something that could only exist at crossroads and in between places. And so that's yes, a good final place to be in the cassette, and in the in between room there. And maybe I can tell you more if you have questions. I think I'll stop here, and that's it, and say thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So, okay, would you mind closing the presentation so that we can sort of see each other better? Okay, for the discussion. Yes, I bet there are questions around, right?
If I may, I'd like to start with a question for Kaitlin, if that's okay. Kaitlin, you talked about the ways in which you categorize the places where she went. And so you have the different types of resorts and so on and so forth. And then you have the other category. Now, having looked whilst you showed us the maps on the other category, it seems to me that there's a very high proportion of really big cities, metropolises, among these others. So I wondered if that might not be a category in itself, because, not least because there is, in terms of life, in terms of infrastructure, there is some comparability between the resorts, yes, sort of the kind of the summer metropolises and the big cities.
Yes, I realized when I look at the others, what I do plan to do is create more categories. And urban cities is definitely one, but it's not just urban. I think what I would also want to do, there's a lot of burgeoning alpine resorts, I realize, in that category as well. So she was a lover of nature and a hiker, an avid hiker. So a lot of these places, I don't know if they're necessarily fully established or how new in the burgeoning of them as alpine resorts, but that's also in that other category. And yeah, I don't like the idea of another category. I do kind of want to separate, but yeah, this idea of having urban as its own category, I didn't think of that. So I do like the idea of that because it is its own set of parameters, shared parameters.
Yeah.
It's very good. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may jump in there, sort of one of the basic questions, not being very sort of knowledgeable about the life and deeds of the Empress, is the question. You suggested on the basis of your observations, simply by her travel habits and her destinations, a certain chronology of her life. In how far, sort of you suggested that a conventional chronology would have 1889 more as a breaking point between things, but you had 3 periods. Can you sort of relate that to a more conventional periodization of her life?
Yeah, I don't know the exact dates offhand, but the first period I had was 1853 to 1874. And I know that around the early 70s, That's about the time when her mother-in-law did die. So she may have felt a little bit of relief and freedom to just go off and do her own thing in that perspective. She also was gifted her own personal train and compartments. Okay. So the technology of her access to transportation technologies at that period was also a big turning point, I think. She didn't particularly like traveling by train. So when she was given access to these imperial yachts, which I don't know when that was, but yeah, when she started sailing, I would guess, looking at the data, that was in the 1880s when she had access to the 2 yachts. But yeah, that kind of, when I think about big life events in her chronology that kind of overlap with the phases I saw, those are the two big ones: the death of her mother-in-law, the access to her personal train compartment. And thinking now about, I don't know for sure, but considering how she started complaining about her personal health and started suffering from sciatica and rheumatoid arthritis, maybe that's why she stopped going on these big hunting expeditions. They say it's aligned with the fact that Bay Middleton, a man that used to escort her on these rides, that there was, you know, another little love story burgeoning there. And then once he got married, she stopped wanting to go on the trips. But I don't know, I think from the data, maybe at that point she started physically suffering and feeling the fallout from such exertions. So those were kind of like the main chronologies that did seem to align with the life events in the data.
Yeah.
May I say something?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's a point that the railway system, it just grew up in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and there are more opportunities to travel around in a more convenient way. And she also took the Orient Express, I know, when she go to Hercules Park. And I would say, okay, the convenient way to travel is something very important, but not the most important maybe. And maybe there's also something personal, because she was more and more self-confident when she grew older and older, and self-confident to say, okay, I want to travel around and to do it. And I think another category maybe could be to look at if that are journeys within the empire or outside, because within that is business. And
yes, I actually did do that, but I have visualizations of that, specifically filtering for whether or not she traveled within. I categorized it as either imperial lands or familial lands, so that also included visiting her family lands in Bavaria, Munich, and Lake Starnberg. And what was interesting about that visualization is that it actually ends up pretty much mapping that first phase of her travels that I saw, where between 1853 and 1874, she basically just traveled within the empire and to see her family. It was just that one trip to Madeira, really. And then she went to Dresden, but that was for a family wedding. She went to Rome, that was to see her sister. But yeah, it was really much like in the 70s is when she left the empire. Travels. Yeah. Yeah, it was also very interesting.
If you compare it I just compared it in 1888, because that's the year I talked about. And in 1888, if you compare it with the journeys and traveling around from Kronprinz Rudolf, her son, still alive in 1888, he also traveled a lot, traveled to Trieste and to Dalmatian, Istrian, and to Budapest and to Prague. And it's quite a lot. And I think they all traveled a lot, but Sisi is special because when she got older, especially in her last 10 years, she traveled for pleasure outside. and went to San Remo and to Nizza and somewhere there in the Côte d'Azur, and she traveled also to the Atlantic Ocean. And yeah, that's the big difference between her family members. They traveled around inside the empire for business, and in her last 10 years she traveled everywhere in Europe and I think Northern Africa, and like, yeah, but I don't believe that there is that's so close to the death of her son that there is something that depends on. That's
Right.
like you mentioned it. It's maybe something else. It's something else. Yeah. Mhm.
I think Thomas,
Yeah,
and then Astrid.
Yes, my question would be about those trains. Where all places where you went to, did they have a train station? Was it decisive for the choice to travel to such a place? And how has one to imagine the traveling by a private train, so to say, because it's not a private compartment, but private train, to be clear. How one has to imagine it. There are timetables. Is there something known about has it to wait or has others to wait? Will the timetable be interrupted by the Empress coming across? I mean, making a mess of the whole timetable. Is something known about that, diaries or whatever?
Evelyn, did you want to go?
But it's your question, but maybe.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, we can go together.
I can answer. I think that's it depends on, because if she has her own train, it means that it's something more than a compartment. I think, and she often used another train, but in her own compartment, and sometimes she really used a Sonderzug. That means that the whole train just brought her to Trieste or something like that, and the train was just for her. But Kaitlin, do you want to answer something else?
Yeah, what I've read, it was not her preferred way of traveling. I think you asked about that. She actually was relatively fearful of trains, and I think at the time it was not uncommon for accidents to happen. She was actually in a train accident. She didn't get hurt.
Yep, she was in one train accident. Yes,
yeah. She actually was the type that would prefer to go by I don't know, horse and buggy. I don't know if that's the right term, and she would walk alongside it. I think she really was very much, that was, I think, her preferred way of traveling. But of course, the further she wanted to go, then she would use these trains to get there. And there were times where, that they would have to take her train and I think move it onto other tracks. I mean, it did cause a kerfluffle. So while she tried to travel in incognito ways, even though they were often announced in the newspapers ahead of time, even when she tried to travel, literally the process of traveling incognito, it was often very obvious that there was someone important there, someone imperial there. So she even gathered a lot of crowds at these train stations where they would build special waiting rooms for her. So she had the impact on the train infrastructure as well, the train station infrastructure as well.
But I think it was both was possible. Sometimes she had her own train. She comes as an empress and travels like an empress. And on the other hand, sometimes she traveled incognito, and her lady in waiting wrote in her diary, "Okay, today we bought second class tickets." Yes. Took the second class. It was okay, but it was the second class. Yes.
But Sisi liked it because no one noticed.
And if no one knows that she is Sisi, she likes traveling second class, likes going by I don't know, by in what's the called railway with horses.
Coach. by horse?
Coach, yes, by
Yeah.
coach.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
and also by tram. She likes
Yeah.
to go by tram if possible, and but only incognito. Yes.
But that's an interesting one, the kind of infrastructure. Yes, that on the one hand side, the travels are obviously influenced by the infrastructure. You can only go by train where the tracks take you. But then, as Kaitlin says, because she is who she is, that the infrastructure is actually influenced by her travels as well. That's quite an interesting point.
How overcrowded were the railroads at the end of the 19th century with trains? I mean, was it easy if coming with your own train? Would it fix easy into a time? I mean, nowadays, it would in Holland become a mess if somebody says, well, I'm coming now with a train, just wait for me. Because every 5 minutes, there will pass a train at the main station.
But you see, Thomas, there are a lot of royalties traveling these days in Holland incognito, and that's why you have to wait all the time.
But how at the time, I mean, how often was a train going from Vienna to Munich or something like that? Is that known? Do you know something about that?
I don't know that.
A regular train, so to say.
Yeah,
but you can. There are lots of books on railway history. So I think sort of about 1920, 1930, the trains were slightly faster than today, and up to that time, they were a bit slower. But I think sort of by around 1900, the speed was about the same. So, and I think also the density of the timetables, depending on where you were going, were quite intense. And we know, for example, that there were from Baden-Baden several trains a day to Paris, right? So it must have been a bit of a headache for those who were the dispatchers at the railroad, right? But I think Astrid, you wanted to move on to another question.
Yes, Evelyn, you talked about, or you briefly mentioned that you tried to map these places that were used in the correspondence, and that you tried to map this onto Moretti's idea of the maps. And I'd like to hear a little more about that, if possible, and also having your two papers together. I did wonder whether you think what your research would in some way benefit from using the database, both as far as these places are concerned, but also, which I only learned today, as far as text tagging is concerned.
Yes, because I was so fascinated by Moretti, and what you all know, Franco Moretti, his theories. I don't know. Should I say something about? No.
I wonder whether you can manage that in 2 minutes, but I think at least the people from the project have been sort of working with his concept, and Kaitlin knows it as well, I guess, from there. So perhaps keep it short, right?
It's the close reading guy, right?
Sorry,
close readings, close and distant readings.
And I think for me it was very important to look. I read Moretti, and then I thought, okay, let's have a look and to Baden-Baden and to Herkulesbad and to Gastein and to Bad Ischl. Yes, because I would have shown you, but there was no proper map I found in the internet, and if you look at all these cities, and they're not cities, they're sparse cities, and I think it was clear to me that Herkulesbad and Bad Gastein looked much the same, like the surroundings with the woods and the hills around, and I thought, okay, they mentioned that it was easier to meet there in Gastein and in Herkulesbad, and I thought, okay, maybe there is a link to the topography and landscape, because in München it was nearly impossible. And if you have München and the map of München, it's there are the boulevards and in the city center, and the parks, they are open and wide and something different. And so I thought, okay, that is something, if you map it, then there is some further information you get. And it's also, if you have Caitlin's map, yes, the same, because for me, it's interesting. You see, okay, then spots come out, and it's what about her habits, because as you mentioned it, in the first years she traveled not so much. Then when she got older, and you see it, you don't get it from the texts. You see it if you point it out and said, okay, there, there. And for me, I would like to work with such a map if it's open for everyone, because then there, yes, you see also where did she travel, and she traveled in the empire and in the east side, and sometimes to England. And then in the later years, she traveled to France, and yeah, I think that's the visualization is very important, because as I told you, the texts are all the same and they're not very interesting, because they all iconic icon painting. I told you, yes, and there you can have a new view on her habits. Yes, and I think it's very important, especially for Sisi, because it's otherwise it's always the same.
Okay. Can I jump in here? Perhaps I have 2 points that I would want to mention. And I know that Thomas is also sitting on a couple of questions still. The one thing that I found very fascinating is obviously the idea that Kaitlin didn't have the time and the opportunity to talk about, is to link it up with the topography of commemoration, right? Not just her lifetime travels, but then see what happens in the places that she visits. We touched upon it when we were talking about the trains, but there are a lot of other kind of influences, obviously, that can be mapped, and also mapped over time, because obviously it makes a difference whether this is a kind of lifetime or posthumous commemoration that she triggers by her travels, right? So perhaps if you want to say 1 or 2 words, Kaitlin, about that. But perhaps I formulate right away my second question, and that goes to Evelyn. And I think sort of what fascinated me, I've been working with the Foucault concept of the heterotopia myself, but more on a more global scale. But if I see it correctly, I mean there are kind of 3 concentric circles in which these kind of heterotopias play out, right? There's this kind of the places of their actual seeing and hiding, right? Sort of meeting. Then there is the kind of literary fiction, which is also creating this kind of ambiguous place. And the third thing, and that's almost the most fascinating and the most dabbling, is the time capsule that she left there, or should we call it a time bomb, right? And I was obviously it worked, because if you said your own research and interest started with this kind of quite rude comments in a footnote by a historian some 30 years later, right? Sort of all of us, there must have been something. And I sort of wanted to ask you if there's more, again, not knowing terribly much about her life and her biographers, are there more sort of similar kind of signs of that she was actually very actively perhaps toying with this idea of her public role and destroying it?
I think so, because she's I think she showed a lot about her public role, and how people look at her, and she destroyed almost everything. That's the Time Capsule is the only box with written material she prepared for after her death. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and she destroyed her private documents. She destroyed the last letter of her son. She She destroyed everything and controlled. She tried to control the memory. But, as you mentioned, the link, yes, between these three sorts of heterotopia, that's for me it was really amazing and interesting, because I thought, okay, is it one world with or are these parts, different parts? But I think maybe they're all part of the same parallel universe. And it was really interesting to see that it was possible to communicate because of their own fantasy. Yes, not the established way of communication, but they tried to find another universe to communicate. Yes, and that was something like really mainstream literature. They took the dream or something like dreams were very common to that at that days, because Sigmund Freud, he was it's the same period, and the Indian fairy tales were very popular. Yes, that's nothing special, but it's typical for their time.
Thank you. Okay, Kaitlin, do you want to say something about this memory project still?
Oh, yeah, sure. Another offshoot of the Sisi project was that I started collecting and mapping out these impacts and influences she had on the places where she visited. So things like, it could be something like actual infrastructure. If they built telegraph wires, I couldn't think of the term, telegraph wires to connect the house, they would often repave roads or pave them for the first time for her arrival. But also in ways that the towns wanted to use her visits or commercialize her in the resort. So a lot of places I noticed like to create these Sisi walking paths that would follow in her footsteps in the spa towns. And a lot of places would put up plaques if she visited, or a big thing that happened after she died and before World War I was putting up statues in memory of her, and kind of taking ownership that she, they're mourning her death or commemorating her life, and it's important to them because she was a part of the spa town's history. So her legacy has definitely lived on in the spa towns in different capacities. What was interesting to look at, this data is a little harder because it's harder to get those starting and end dates for some of these things. But what was interesting to see for those that I could get accurate dates for is when you watch those visualizations bloom, the time frame and then the borders of things. So of course, a lot of things happened between her death and World War I. And then there was a relatively quiet period. And then another blooming after the fall of communism, where these places would re-erect these statues that had been destroyed during World War I or taken down because it didn't mesh with the myths and memories that the communist regimes wanted to uphold. And then another interesting thing was to see how places that she visited that hadn't initially commemorated her, that didn't put up statues right after she died or start their Sisi vagues or Sisi walking paths around the time of her life, was I guess it is tied to about the 100-year anniversary of her death. So around the turn of the century, you have places like France where she visited, in Normandy, here in Amsterdam and Zandvoort on the seaside, this cult of Sisi, and this wanting to memorialize Sisi and her presence in the space has expanded beyond kind of that initial empire. So that you have Sisi statues in France now on the coast and here in Amsterdam. And there was a walk that I almost spontaneously bought tickets to go fly to Cromer in England for, because I saw it on March 1st, and this past March 1st in 2022, and then like March 3rd, they were having this walk around the seaside resort in the footsteps of Sisi. And that was the like the newest and the only presence I saw of her in that seaside resort. So yeah, it's something that she seems to be having a reinvigoration within the past decade or so. But yeah, that's what I can really say about the general memorializing
Still work
of
in
her.
progress, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Evelyn, did you want to add something there?
I want to add something, and I think that this memorial thing and this memorial project, Kaitlin, it's the most interesting one of us all, because the disappearing and coming back of the memorials, you can see so much more information about identity in the states, in the Eastern European states, and also in Trieste in Italy. The memorial disappeared after World War One, and now it's on the original place again. And there are so many informations about the identity of the people who live there, but also about the identity of the states, and that's really interesting.
Yeah, just one final footnote on that. Trieste is an interesting case, and then it was really interesting to see how even during the reign of communism in places like Slovakia and Hungary, you would see these statues kind of re-emerging on the map in the 60s. So there was something kind of going on, I guess, in the late 60s that these places felt emboldened and were enabled and wanted to kind of reassert or re-erect Sisi as part of their image and identity.
Super. Okay, Thomas, I see you're still burning to discuss a few issues here.
Well, it's just three very short questions. I think you can answer them very shortly also because of the time. The first question was about the last pic Kaitlin showed, where you saw Sisi with another guy. My question is, was it the Bavarian king, Louis II? It seems
yeah, actually, I should show that again.
That was the first question of the three.
While it's loading, actually, she's off to the left. Oh, my screen sharing is paused. Oh, I don't know if it'll work, but she was actually off to the left.
Oh, so she wasn't in the middle.
She wasn't in the middle, which I thought was
yeah,
which I thought was interesting. Why is it paused? I can't share it for whatever reason.
Anyway, so I mean, there was a lot of spatial distance between the two images.
Well, was it the Bavarian king?
It was her brother.
So he was on there. My second question is, how often did Franz Josef went with her to spas? Was it very often or rather seldom? And my last question is, that at the beginning, apparently they always went to Bad Kissingen. She went also always to Bad Kissingen. Was there a reason for it, and all the connection by the Habsburgians, or whatever was the reason that they always traveled to Bad Kissingen in the beginning, and only later started to travel all around Europe, so to say? That are my two last questions.
Bad Kissingen, the reason for that was because she was advised by the imperial doctor at the time to go there specifically. So her first. Yeah, it was kind of these after cure follow-ups from the first big health crisis she had when she was allegedly suffering from terrible pulmonary disease, and she went to Madeira to rest and to get the fresh air, but part of the follow-up from her doctor, and I think it was actually, Evelyn, you might know, I think it wasn't the imperial doctor, it was the family Bavarian doctor who kind of knew that she needed these breaks from the society, from the imperial culture. So he told her that for medical reasons, or he told everyone for medical reasons, that she needed to go to Bad Kissingen, which was essentially
Bavaria.
Yeah. And so it was this guaranteed break in the year. So that was medical advice, whereas later on her trips were basically, were freer, and I think she had more agency over choosing them. And then I forget the first part of your question. Oh yeah, so that's what it would. So that's what's interesting. And I didn't have time to show it here, but you can also create these social networking maps in this database. So you can link people with a location. So I started doing that. But what it shows is, the Sisi bubble is very big because she met with everybody, obviously, because this database is based off of hers. But the second biggest bubble I have so far is her husband, Franz Josef. So he did travel with her, or at least meet up with her for parts of her trips. He was very much he was a workaholic and tied to his job, and he didn't have the freedoms that she did. But he would go and spend time with her, at least partially during her stays at these spa resorts. So he was a big presence in these travels of hers.
But he could have gone from the spa. I mean, there was possibility already, telephone or whatever at the second period, so he could take a spa resort as his residence for 2 weeks and work there.
Which he did.
Which he
Yeah.
did, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, on this sad note on workaholics and travelers, I think it's time to wrap up. Our time is running out. Thank you for these two fascinating contributions, which indeed match each other nicely, although sort of the scope of travels in both contributions were slightly different. And I think sort of one thing is terribly sure, without further time capsules or not, Sisi is going to be around still for a very long time. And I think sort of that should help Evelyn really to sell her book and Kaitlin to write hers and find wide audiences. And at the same time, obviously, it was again kind of putting interesting nuances to our own research on the spa more generally and spa culture, particularly Evelyn's contribution on these kind of both the kind of reducing of social distances and the possibility of intimacy, I think is a very interesting kind of aspect that we will certainly sort of integrate into our own take on the spa. So that was a very interesting talk. Many thanks to everyone who shared their thoughts with us in the discussion. And the last thing I have to announce, for the time being, that has been our last online seminar. We are considering to come back with new talks in the autumn, and we will let you know in due time. So thanks very much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye. Goodbye.